South Africa once had a prison so feared, so secure, that no one had ever escaped. Its walls were said to be unbreakable, its record flawless. Then came Ananias Mathe. In 2006, this ruthless gang boss and rapist pulled off what seemed impossible. Newspapers called him a modern Houdini, a man who slipped out of South Africa's toughest prison like a ghost. But the truth was far darker. His escape was not about magic or genius. It was about corruption, negligence, and a broken system that let the country's most dangerous criminal walk free. This is the real story of Ananias Mathe, the man who turned Seisemed's prison into a national embarrassment. Born in 1976 inches Mozambique, Ananias Mathe would grow from an ordinary young man into one of the most notorious criminals the country had ever seen. Some say he once had military training, and whether or not that's true, the way he later ran his operations showed a frightening level of discipline and strategy. By the early 2000s, Mathe had crossed into South Africa, not as a petty thief, but as the ruthless commander of a violent gang that sometimes numbered up to 40 men. From his base in Chikambane, Mozambique, Mathe built a syndicate that specialized in high-stakes crime. These were not small-time robberies. His gang perfected the art of cash and transit heists. In broad daylight, heavily armed groups of 15 to 20 men would storm armored vans, blasting their way through security and vanishing with millions in cash. These robberies were not sloppy or rushed. They were planned like military missions, executed with precision, and carried out with a level of confidence that left communities and police forces alike in shock. But what made Mathe infamous was not just the robberies or the scale of his crimes. It was the brutality that followed him everywhere he went. Violence wasn't just a tool for him. It was part of his identity. Police and investigators would later call him the devil's child, because his actions carried a level of cruelty that went beyond profit. Reports revealed that when women were caught in the chaos of his crimes, they often became additional victims of abuse. This wasn't about money. It was about power, control, and fear. This mixture of military-style robberies and ruthless cruelty gave him a reputation that spread like wildfire. Communities lived in fear of him. Journalists wrote about him with shock. Police officers saw him as a predator who thrived on destruction. By the time he was finally arrested in late 2005, the list of crimes tied to his name seemed almost unreal. His first charge sheet carried 51 counts, including attempted carjacking and armed robbery. Even that wasn't the end. When he was finally put on trial, the full extent of his reign of terror was revealed to the world. Out of 71 charges, he was found guilty on 67 of them. The crimes ranged from violent robberies to attempted organized crime and By the time Ananias Mathe stood before the courts in 2005, he was already more than just a criminal. He was a nightmare wrapped in human form, a man whose violence had carved fear into entire communities. The guilty verdicts only confirmed what people already knew. South Africa was dealing with someone far more dangerous than the average gangster. Yet locking him up was never going to be the end of the story. For Mathe, prison was not a cage. It was simply another challenge to outsmart. His first escape came almost too easily, and that made it all the more humiliating for the police. In April 2005, barely 4 months after being arrested, he was sitting in a high-risk detention cell inside Johannesburg's Central Police Station. It should have been impossible for him to get out, but Mathe understood people better than walls and locks. He knew that the real cracks in any system were not found in concrete or steel, but in human weakness. So he slipped 15,000 rand into the hands of the very officers meant to keep him in chains. And just like that, the country's most wanted man strolled out the front door. For 9 long months, he vanished, a ghost moving through the townships, hiding across borders, and planning his next moves, while his legend only grew darker. The police scrambled in embarrassment, pouring resources into the hunt, and when they finally caught up with him in December 2005, there was no room for mistakes this time. They decided Mathe would be sent to the one place that no man had ever broken free from, a place built to crush every ounce of rebellion and lock away South Africa's most feared offenders. Seisemed Penitentiary in Pretoria. Seisemed was not an ordinary prison. For 36 years, it had stood as the ultimate fortress of South Africa's correctional system, a cold monument of concrete and steel. It was home to men who had tried and failed to challenge its strength. Its reputation was so ironclad that even seasoned criminals spoke about it with a kind of fearful respect. Escape, everyone believed, was impossible. But with Mathe, trouble began before he even crossed the gates. Later investigations would reveal something astonishing. As an awaiting trial prisoner, he should never have been sent to Seisemed in the first place. The rules were clear. The prison was strictly for sentenced offenders, men whose guilt had already been proven in court. Yet somehow, through either negligence or arrogance, that rule was broken. Correctional Services Minister Nkande Balfour would later admit his shock at the mistake, but by then it was too late. The system had already bent its own rules for the man who was best at exploiting weakness, and the fortress itself, for all its fearsome reputation, was not the flawless cage it claimed to be. By 2006, officials quietly admitted that CMAX was an old facility, designed decades earlier to hold death row inmates under a now abolished system. Its walls looked intimidating, but they lacked the advanced technology and reinforced designs of modern supermax prisons. What kept inmates inside was not cutting-edge security, but the weight of history and the belief that CMAX was unbreakable. That illusion was about to be destroyed, and it would be Ananias Mathe who exposed just how fragile South Africa's toughest prison really was. Ananias Mathe was not the kind of man to sit quietly in a cell and accept his fate. From the moment he was locked inside CMAX, he began testing the fortress that was supposed to hold him forever. He studied the walls, the routines of the guards, and the tiniest flaws in the prison structure. What investigators later discovered was that Mathe had tried to break out not once, not twice, but 4 times before his infamous escape in 2006. Each attempt failed, but those failures were not wasted. They were experiments, each one teaching him something new about the prison's weaknesses. By that point, it should have been clear that he was a major risk. Any other inmate would have been locked under the strictest surveillance with guards watching his every move. But CMAX underestimated just how determined and calculating Mathe was. His persistence showed he would never stop looking for a way out. Yet instead of tightening security, the prison continued with business as usual. On the night of the 18th of November 2006, Ananias Mathe slipped out of his cell and into history. The story that followed became a piece of South African folklore, a tale of superhuman cunning and physical impossibility. But beneath the myth lay a far more mundane and disturbing truth, one meticulously uncovered by a multi-departmental task team tasked with answering a single humiliating question: how did this happen? The public version of the escape was cinematic. Mathe, locked in cell 4 of the A6 ward, began his impossible breakout. He was, according to official procedure, supposed to be in handcuffs and leg shackles at all times. Yet somehow he freed himself from these restraints. He then allegedly broke through the wall around the small reinforced window of his cell, removing the bulletproof glass and its frame. What followed was the story's most iconic detail. Mathe, a well-built man, stripped naked and coated his entire body in petroleum jelly. He then contorted his body and slid, head first, through the impossibly narrow opening, a gap measuring just 20 centimeters high and 60 centimeters wide. Once outside his cell, he supposedly used a hook fashioned from his bedpost to lower his prison clothes, which he had tied up in bed linen. Before disappearing into the night, he left one final defiant message for his captors, scrawled on the prison wall: F you. The story was perfect. It was unbelievable, terrifying, and it turned a brutal criminal into a legendary anti-hero. The official investigation, conducted by a task team from the Department of Correctional Services, DCS, the South African Police Service, SAPS, and the National Intelligence Agency, NIA, painted a very different picture. It was not a story of genius, but of a catastrophic top-to-bottom system failure. The first failure was a clear and ignored warning. Just 5 days before the escape, on November 13, Mathe had been moved from his original cell, Cell 49, after damaging it. A search the following morning revealed that the window in that cell was loose. This was a classic sign of a planned escape attempt. Yet, instead of raising the alarm and implementing stricter measures, officials simply moved him to a new cell and apparently failed to follow up on the security breach. On the night of the escape itself, the prison's security protocol collapsed entirely. The investigation found overwhelming evidence of non-compliance with standard procedures. Officials on duty had failed to properly apply Mathe's handcuffs and foot cuffing, a direct violation of the orders for a high-risk inmate. The guards, who were supposed to be conducting regular patrols, were distracted. It was a Saturday night, heavy rain was falling, and many officers were reportedly watching a double-header soccer match on television. This gross negligence meant that the escape, which must have taken place hours earlier, was not discovered until approximately 21:50, when an officer on the catwalk finally noticed the missing window. The physical security of the prison was just as compromised. Key watchtowers, towers 1, 3, and 4, were unmanned due to understaffing. The investigation concluded that Mathe's probable escape route took him over the prison wall near the unmanned Tower 2, where he would have faced no resistance. The entire escape was aided by what the report called mishandling of the keys to Tower 2 and a complete breakdown in shift change protocols. Evidence also pointed to a deliberate cover-up. Investigators found fraudulent manipulation of documents and entries in the shift register, in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to hide the timeline of events and the guards' negligence. Multiple officials failed their polygraph tests, some more than once. In the aftermath, members of parliament visiting the prison were shocked to find that the window Mathe had supposedly escaped through had been hastily cemented shut, a move they viewed as a blatant attempt to destroy evidence. But the final and most crucial piece of the puzzle dismantled the Houdini myth entirely. It was later revealed that Ananias Mathe had not relied on petroleum jelly alone. He had used his old trusted method, money. He had paid a bribe of 80,000 rand to prison warders, buying their complicity and ensuring that the eyes meant to be watching him were turned away at the critical moment. He did not defeat a perfect system. He simply paid his way through the holes of one that was already broken. When word broke that Ananias Mathe had slipped out of CMAX, South Africa was thrown into panic. This was not just any escapee. This was a man accused of more than 50 violent crimes, a figure already whispered about as if he were half man, half myth. Now he was loose in the streets, and suddenly no home felt safe, no road seemed secure. The media wasted no time in fanning the flames, filling newspapers and television screens with his face, updating the nation with every rumor and every false lead. For 2 long weeks, Mathe was the most wanted man in South Africa, a fugitive who seemed to vanish and reappear like a ghost. But while the public saw headlines about a daring outlaw, behind the scenes, the police were cracking under the pressure. Every hour that passed without progress deepened the embarrassment. Their mistakes only made things worse. In one case, they grabbed the wrong man and ended up charging him with nothing more than marijuana possession. Another blunder was even more shocking. Officers ambushed someone they thought was Mathe, only to discover they had Reverend Matlotlo Rabotapi, a church minister with the misfortune of resembling the fugitive. The image of police wounding an innocent man was splashed across the country, feeding the idea that Mathe was untouchable while the state was clumsy and desperate. For the detectives leading the hunt, it was maddening. Arnold Boonstra, the officer in charge, did not hide his frustration. To the press, he called Mathe the devil's child and admitted it was as if the fugitive had the luck of the devil itself. Leads evaporated as quickly as they came, and every time the police thought they were closing in, Mathe seemed to slip through another crack. Boonstra made a promise that summed up the mood inside the force. "I will not sleep until we catch him." Those words were less a boast than a desperate vow. For 2 weeks, Mathe lived like a shadow, moving from place to place, stealing cars, relying on contacts, and avoiding the tightening net of police patrols. His ability to stay ahead made him look like a mastermind, but his downfall would come not through some grand police operation, but because of a single mistake. On the 4th of December 2006, in the wealthy Johannesburg suburb of Crayhull, Mathe hijacked a car. To him, it was just another getaway vehicle. What he did not realize was that the car carried something invisible but to his freedom, a satellite tracking device. The moment the vehicle was reported stolen, a signal went out. Private security companies and police units suddenly had a digital trail leading them directly to South Africa's most wanted man. The fugitive who had humiliated the police with his ability to disappear could no longer hide. Technology had stripped away his ghostly aura, turning him into nothing more than a dot on a screen. When the police closed in, Mathe tried to fight, but there was no clever trick left, no loose window to wiggle through. Cornered and outnumbered, he was several times in the legs and buttocks before finally being subdued. The man who had once been called South Africa's Houdini had been brought down, not by an elaborate sting or a brilliant detective, but by a stolen car that silently betrayed him. His reign of freedom, which had terrified a nation and embarrassed its police force, ended not in glory, but in on the pavement and flashing GPS coordinates. Bringing Mathe back into custody was only the beginning. His trial dragged on for years, and when it finally came to an end in December 2009, the verdict was devastating for him. The court found him guilty on 67 of the 71 charges he faced. It was a staggering list: assault, attempted assault, robbery, theft, and attempted. One by one, the crimes that had made him a household name in South Africa were read out, and the court delivered what seemed like the only possible outcome. Mathe was sentenced to 54 years in prison, and it was made clear he would have to serve at least 43 before he could even think about parole. For a man who had once toyed with the idea of endless freedom, the judgment was a hammer blow. But the reckoning did not stop with him. His escape from Pretoria's seisemed prison had embarrassed the entire country, and the Department of Correctional Services could not pretend it had been a small oversight. The system had been humiliated, and someone had to take the fall. 6 wardens who were linked directly to the failures on the night Mathe disappeared from his cell were dismissed without ceremony. Yet even their punishment did not silence the anger. The scandal exploded into Parliament. A committee was formed to investigate, and when its members visited the prison, what they found only fueled suspicion. Mathe's old cell had been tampered with, the infamous window quickly cemented over, as though someone was desperate to erase the evidence. The committee accused the department of trying to cover up the truth, calling their official report vague, incomplete, and deeply unsatisfying. They demanded more answers, and their outrage forced the government to act. What followed was a sweeping overhaul of prison security. Procedures were rewritten, prisons were reclassified, and new surveillance technology was introduced. Mathe's escape had exposed the cracks in South Africa's correctional system, and now the country had no choice but to rebuild. After the trial, Mathe was sent to a prison that was nothing like Pretoria's seisemed. This was Ibongweni Correctional Center in Kokstad, a place designed to crush any dream of escape. Known as Kokstad Seisemed, it was South Africa's only true super maximum prison, a fortress of steel and concrete, built for men who could not be trusted with anything less. Every corner bristled with surveillance. Every door and corridor was controlled with strict precision. Here, there was no bribing your way to freedom, no loose windows, no careless guards willing to look the other way. The man once labeled as South Africa's Houdini finally met his match. He tried to test the walls, as he always did. Twice he attempted to break free, but both times he failed completely. The very thing that had made him legendary in Pretoria now revealed the truth. His escape had never been about magic or superhuman talent. It had been about weakness in the system, about corruption, about people not doing their jobs. Kokstad offered him no such loopholes. Against an unbending machine of modern security, Ananias Mathe was just another inmate in a gray uniform. Yet his presence still left a mark. Guards at Kokstad admitted that they never dropped their guard with him inside. His reputation alone forced the staff into constant vigilance. As one senior official put it, "It is through him that we've raised our vigilance at all times." For the prison, Mathe was a living reminder of what could happen if even a single mistake was made. For him, it was the end of the illusion. The man who once made the entire nation tremble had finally run out of walls he could break through. For a man who once held an entire nation in fear, the end of Ananias Mathe's story could not have been more ordinary or humiliating. The gangster who had been branded South Africa's Houdini did not go out in a blaze of fire, nor did he vanish mysteriously into the night with one last master escape. Instead, his body, which had once been the supposed key to his freedom, slowly betrayed him. By the final months of 2016, Mathe was no longer plotting his way out of Kokstad's impenetrable walls. He was instead trapped inside a body that had begun to fail in the most miserable of ways. He complained of agonizing stomach pains, begging for treatment, though at first the prison authorities dismissed him. After all, this was the man who had tricked and bribed his way out of seisemed, and many believed his illness was just another trick, a fresh scheme to land himself in a hospital where he could attempt another daring getaway. But this time, there was no plot. His condition worsened rapidly, forcing officials to shuttle him between Kokstad's medical unit and several outside hospitals. He underwent multiple operations in the space of just a few weeks, yet nothing seemed to ease his suffering. On the 27th of December 2016, the man who had once slipped through South Africa's toughest prison, not at the hands of guards, not in a shootout with police, but in a hospital bed in Durban. He was only 40 years old. The cause of doctors said, was complications from severe constipation and urinary retention. For a man who had been painted as almost supernatural, a devil's child who could outwit the state itself, his demise was painfully human, stripped of all drama and stripped of all dignity. His body was later released to his family, who took him back to Mozambique for burial. And with that, the curtain finally fell on a man who had once turned the South African justice system upside down. What remains of Ananias Mathe's story is less about the man himself, and more about the system that failed to contain him. He was a predator who scarred lives and communities, and there is no celebrating that. Mathe proved something chillingly simple. that the weakest part of any high-security facility is not the concrete or the steel but the people running it. Guards can be bribed, rules can be ignored, paperwork can be manipulated. His story forced the country to confront those truths head-on, sparking dismissals, parliamentary inquiries, and reforms designed to stop another humiliation of that scale from happening again.